You are listening to episode number 26 of the Happy Choir podcast. Hola people, it's me, Carlos Cordero, host and creator of the Happy Choir podcast, helping you connect with others through choral music. In today's episode, I had a fantastic conversation with Fahad Siadat, who is a composer, conductor, singer, dancer. He does it all. The most exciting part for us here in the Happy Choir podcast is that he includes choral music in most everything that he does. As you will learn in this episode, Fahad also has his music publishing company. Siadat Music Publishing is a company devoted to the advocacy of new choral works and emerging composers. And I'm excited to have this conversation today that includes so much that we had to split this episode in two parts. In this week, we're going to not only learn about his career and how he got into choral music, but we also get to talk about some of the pieces that he publishes and to listen to the performances. Before we get into that, I want to remind you the ways that you can help the Happy Choir podcast to grow even more. You can leave a review in iTunes, you can share it with the people that you love, and also you can go to Patreon, where for as little as $3 a month, you can help this show so much, and you cannot even imagine how much impact $3 make. Patreon.com/ComposerCordero is the link that you want to share or to visit to help us in the Happy Choir podcast. Now, let's get to this interview. Yay! In today's episode, we have a wonderful guest who has done it almost all in the choral world. Fahad Siadat, welcome to the Happy Choir podcast.
Thank you, Carlos. It's nice to be here.
Do you feel that you've done it all?
It's when people ask me what I do, I often just answer that I'm a musician, and and they say, well, what does that mean? And I say, well, it means everything that being a musician, kind of entails. Excuse me. For the most part, I find that being a freelancer means that you're doing some level of composing and conducting and improvising and performing and of course arts administration and business, right? I think every freelancer is an artist entrepreneur, and so because of that, I've embraced having a multifaceted career, and it's worked. So I don't know if I can say I've done all of it, but I feel like I've done a fair bit. I mean, I help run a church choir. I teach choir to college. I'm in the middle of doing opera runs right now. I'm writing an oratorio. So all those things, we're about to do Jesus Christ Superstar. I'm going to perform in it. I'm going to play Jesus. So.
And it is very exciting because I feel that it also frees us up from, the model of, for example, me saying, I'm a composer and I don't do anything else. But
sure.
Then you realize that you have to do like 800 other things to get things out there.
I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what it means to be a professional. A lot of the composers that I've talked to, when we discuss how much of our time is spent every day doing what, a sadly low percentage of our time is spent actually composing and putting notes on the page, right? So as part of my own artistic practice, I have to sort of carve out this specific hour of time a day. And then the rest of it is applying for grants and making connections with people and being in rehearsal and figuring out what my next gig is, things like that. But unfortunately, being a full-time composer doesn't mean I actually spend 8 hours a day writing music. It means I spend plenty of time dreaming about it and thinking about it, but actually sitting at the piano or with a microphone or whatever it is, if I'm lucky, an hour or two a day, maybe, that's kind of how that goes.
And I think that, it will make us crazy too, to just be inputting notes 8 hours a day.
Totally. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And a lot of what contemporary music looks like is less about that anyway. I've really, Los Angeles, the city where I'm living, is in a golden age of new music right now. And a lot of this conversation around new music is looking at sort of non-traditional ways of creating work. And so a lot of my performance practice has embraced improvisation in different ways, or doing things with voice and electronics. I have a voice and electronics that I've been touring. And and of course it's funny, because we're talking about all this stuff, and none of this has to do with choral music, which is why I'm sort of excited to be on this show and talk about how this conversation around new music and the things I'm talking about right now fit into the choral world, because I think they've sort of divided. We've got new music on one half and we have new choral music on the other half. And a lot of my work is in both of those worlds separately, but the most important work that I'm doing is about how to bridge them together.
And then thank you so much for taking the time, because that's exactly what I love about this interview now. And what I see, it's a connecting dot between in your career, in everything that you do, that you don't see things just, as one thing, but you want to explore and bring something from this side to this other side, and then try to see what's there. And it's exciting to see the products that then appear because of.
Yeah, it's the conversation around new music and what's happening in the orchestral world and in chamber music and in solo vocal literature is just, it's so different. Choral music tends to be a lot more conservative. It tends to look in different directions as other kinds of new music. New music is looking in the sort of northeasterly direction, and I don't think that choral music is necessarily looking backwards. I mean, I think some composers maybe are happily doing that, but maybe they're looking more to the west or northwest. It's just they've really diverged, and so what I found is that by taking aspects of what's happening in new music and applying them and introducing them to people in the choral music world, we don't have to make giant innovations to move the needle forward and to just engage people in a conversation of music that it feels more relevant and exciting to other musics that they listen to, and that they're unfamiliar with in the choral world.
I feel, and at least that has been true for my journey, is a lot of allowing yourself to go to these places of writing this expression that you want to do, or writing this idea that you want, even though if it's not choral, as
sure.
Many people will say, that's not choral, no, don't write that. But then you allow yourself to try to express something differently. And
sure,
I just believe it's exciting to think of composition that way.
Yeah, well, and even without leaving what choral music is, right? I mean, there are some really important restrictions in choral culture that we have to pay attention to, right? So the Chorus America releases this choral impact study, and in the most recent version, I believe the statistic was that over 50 million Americans sing in a choir on a weekly basis. It's something like more than 10% of the country. And if I remember correctly, I believe that this does not include school groups, right? So this doesn't include children. This is adults in America. And granted, most of that is in churches. But if you compare that, I think there's something like 200,000 community and professional choruses in America. And again, this is including church choirs. But if you compare that to the number of community and professional orchestras, there's only 2,000 or fewer. So it's a huge difference. Like the number of people who are engaging in choral music as performers, not just even as audience, that's a whole different number, right? But as performers is huge. And it creates really important restrictions that we have to keep in mind, right? So when I'm writing a piece of music, and this happens with new music all the time. You write a new string quartet and it gets performed by a group, and then it's never heard in public again. You hope that they liked it enough to want to make a recording of it, right? But in choral music, if you write a piece that's for Roomful of Teeth, or it's for The Crossing, there's a good chance that no other group is ever going to perform it again, right? Those top level ensembles are specialize in a certain kind of work, and very few other groups are willing to tackle that stuff. There are some really great new music groups, and I've had the pleasure of singing in a number of them, that are willing to tackle those kinds of big pieces. We've done pieces that Roomful of Teeth have done. We've done big pieces by Ted Hearn, and I'm thinking about groups like C4 in New York or C3LA in Los Angeles, and that's a pleasure to get to do those. But those groups are rare. So for most composers, we are looking at avocational singers, and we're looking at singers that are not pursuing music professionally, that they are teachers or doctors or lawyers, or they work at grocery stores or in marketing or whatever. They're just like your kind of normal everyday people. and they just love to sing. And so how do we write music that is for avocational singers, that's like 4 parts without a million divisis, that doesn't have really extended harmonies, that is still feels relevant to the conversation of 21st century music? And that's how I've been trying to bridge the gap, right? Because so much of new music is about rhythmic and harmonic and melodic complexity. And but there's another branch of music that actually I see a lot more on the West Coast, I see a lot more in Los Angeles in particular, that is about finding and embracing a certain kind of simplicity in music, or in engaging with influences that you haven't traditionally seen in Western classical music, right? So a lot of like the minimalism and gamelan influenced music started in California. Even John Cage, and those kinds of people, before they really made a name for themselves in New York, their training was like at UCLA. And I think there's this sort of influence from musics from different traditions and different cultures that have been a big part of that. And I think that's how I came into it too. Like I grew up at like the very tail end of Gen X life and culture, which means, and I'm from Oregon originally, so that means I grew up with grunge, right? Like the music that I grew up with was very much the Seattle grunge sound. My favorite bands are Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, love Alice in Chains, and of course Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Like those are the groups that I really grew up listening to, and that transitioned really nicely into like a love of metal. And that was most of my upbringing and music that I listened to. And I didn't grow up in church. I'm not Christian. I was raised Muslim. And so, I didn't grow up singing at all, let alone singing choral music, let alone singing church hymns, which as I've become older and I'm in the choral world, I see that many people that are in the choral world grew up in that life. Yeah. I can't tell you the number of music directors I know whose names are Jonathan or David or James or Jonathan David.
Yeah.
It's so weird, right? I mean, it's a huge amount of people. And they're sort of like, oh yeah, we grew up singing all the time. We grew up singing carols. We grew up singing hymns. That's just not my influence, right? I grew up with this very particular brand of rock and roll that was emphasizing sound and experimentation. And although I've come to embrace and love choral music as one of my primary professional avenues, I'm allowing those sounds to be influenced and to be influences on my choral music. And I'm seeing that more and more. You get people like Missy Mazzoli, right, who are these like big classical music composers, but then also have like indie bands, or Du Yun, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018. And she's actually one of the composers in the opera that I'm performing right now called Sweetland in Los Angeles. And she's got like a noise punk band that she tours with in New York, right? So, and not to mention, of course, like all of the Chinese folk music that she lets influence her work as well. So those sorts of influences are becoming more and more important in the new music world. And what I'm trying to do is encourage composers and audiences and singers to allow that stuff to come into their choral music as well.
That's wonderful. No, that's perfect, because, and I love how we transition also to how you came into music and how, your past then influences what you do, because I feel that's important too, to then allow your story to come into your music, because there is no way that we can deny that, or else we're going to, do a template of something else, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's interesting as I get older to compare myself and my life to my colleagues, right? And just to see how a certain kind of music was such an integral part of their life. And, and how we've kind of like found these interesting middle grounds. The church where I work is of course, a very open place, because again, I'm not Christian and they really don't care. But the music director there is someone that his name is David Harris, and he's someone I worked with for many years, doing new music in New York with C4. And, and he comes from a very traditional church background. He's from Alabama, and he grew up in the church doing music. Everyone in his family sings. His brother's also a choral director. It's just one of those things. And that's very different than my life, where like, I don't have any musicians in my family. I'm the first musician in my family, as far as we can tell, for at least 1,000 years. That's as far back as my family could chart it.
Wow.
So those, like, just coming from those backgrounds and the kind of sounds and music that we have in our ear, David and I can collaborate really well. And I'm the assistant conductor at this church, and because of our shared interest in new music, we program a ton of new work. We premiere a new piece at our church like every 2 or 3 months, and we tend to do a lot of experimental work. And it's been a really great kind of breeding ground, and just like a petri dish for how to grow experimental music in an avocational choral setting, right? I mean, we have some section leaders that are professionals, but the vast majority of our choir are just volunteer singers. And it's been a conversation about how to get them on board, how to get our church choir on board when we want to do kind of out there stuff, or not just the choir, I'm sorry, the church congregation on board. And they are, like, we've developed a culture that people are excited about what we're going to bring to the table, and they're curious. And it's been interesting to see how well a different kind of new music can take off in a very traditional choral setting. And some of that's LA, right? LA is just a place that sort of defies tradition. LA really embraces being rebellious and and being experimental in its creative output. So, and I think also the tie to creativity and to spiritual exploration has also been like a really core component to LA's culture. So I think finding a home for experimental music in a religious institution makes sense here. I don't know if it would anywhere else, but
and it's wonderful because then also one realizes, and I think that's one of the most important things here, that realize that you can be part of that too, as a congregation,
Yes.
I mean, so many people might think that, no, that's not for us, we cannot do that, there is no money, or there is no contacts, or I don't know, all those things that people are scared about, commissions and new music, and it's wonderful. You're able to do all of these things. And I also, going to your websites, I also feel it goes so well with the description on your About section that I want to read right now. It says, Fahad is an advocate of innovative and adventurous music, particularly for vocal ensembles. I just love that first phrase, because as you talk about all of that you do, it's exactly this. It's exactly opening the doors and seeing what else is up.
Well, I'll just say this idea of advocacy is, when you were asking me, so like, what do you do? Like, you kind of do it all. And it's been hard to find what the overarching umbrella is for what I do, right? Because I do think that all these different activities are not unrelated. Like, yes, I can say, like, I do music and I'm a musician, but I've found that there is an overarching mission that drives the work that I do. Right. And I am happiest and I feel most fulfilled. I'm most in that like flow state when I find myself as an advocate for new music. And when I think of my work as advocacy, then that can express itself as a conductor of the music that I program, right? Or if I feel like there is music that there's a hole in something that needs to be heard, sounds that need to be heard, I can create it as a composer, or I can curate it and program it as a performer, or as a publisher. Like, a lot of what I do with my publishing company is finding that music that I feel like doesn't have as much of a platform or needs to be heard and is really wonderful. Basically, the music that I want to perform over and over again, and give it a platform and be an advocate for it. And that was kind of how the publishing company got started in the first place. So, yeah.
Before we dive into that exactly topic that we're going to, then how did you get into choral music if you didn't start, as a usual story of singing in church or singing in a choir? So how do you get there?
Okay, so music in my family's culture, and I think in a lot of the Middle East, is considered an important, like, the arts and music are considered an important part of one's edification, but it's not necessarily considered like a great career path, right? So on my mother's side of the family, most of my family members are in business of some sort. There's a lot of entrepreneurs. And on my father's side, there's a lot of like academics and people in the medical profession and things like that. But again, not musicians. So I always took piano lessons as a kid. That was just considered part of my edification as a child. Like, to be a complete human being, you need to have the arts.
Yeah.
And I remember we moved in Oregon. We moved out of town into the country, about not too far out, like 5 miles outside of town, but it was far enough that we didn't have TV anymore. We had like 3.5 channels. One was kind of fuzzy, and so, you know, I was about 10 years old or something like that, and I didn't have TV as a form of entertainment. And so I started reading a lot more, and then there was a piano in our house, and I would just start playing the piano, right? And so that was kind of how I started composing. Was I would just like make stuff up on the piano, and then in middle school, that we had to either take wood shop or we had to take band. And I really didn't want to take wood shop. I don't know. I just wasn't my thing. Now I wish I'd taken wood shop. Wood shop sounds awesome. But I had taken band, and I didn't know anything about playing band instruments. I played a little bit of piano. But this girl that I had a crush on was playing clarinet in the school band. And so they were going around and they were asking everybody, oh, what instrument do you want to play? And a lot of people, like, you know, their parents had ideas for what they should play, or they already had instruments in their homes. And she was like, oh, I'm playing clarinet. And I didn't know what the clarinet was, but I wanted to like be in her section because I had a big crush on her. And so they were like, exactly. Oh, we need more clarinet players. And I was like, yeah, I play clarinet too. I'm going to play clarinet.
Exactly.
And I didn't even know what one looked like. I mean, I was so ignorant. And 2 weeks later, she dropped out of band. Oh. And I was stuck playing clarinet for the next like 12 years. So I got involved. I was a really big band nerd. So through middle school, and I just always loved music. And I played band through high school. And about my junior year in high school, I started realizing I really wanted to do music. I knew that was going to be, I really wanted to pursue it as a profession. And so I started just taking all the music classes that my high school had to offer. And I took jazz band, and I played piano there, and I took the symphonic band, and I also took like the auditioned wind ensemble, and then I took choir when I could. Like I was like, oh, I'll just, you know, I have like an extra credit, I have some electives, I'm gonna audition for the choir, and I got into my high school's chamber choir, and I was like, this is cool. It was just another thing.
Yeah.
But I thought I was going to be a clarinet player, and I thought I was going to be like a band teacher my whole life. And then come my senior year, I started taking voice lessons, and I realized I had a better aptitude for singing. And so I ended up auditioning as a vocal performance major for college. And it was just like, so I didn't really start singing until I was like about 16 or 17 years old. And I didn't start taking lessons until my senior year in high school. And I ended up getting into college as a vocal performance person. And I got there and I realized I didn't want to actually be a band teacher. I wanted to be a composer. I had done some composing in high school. Mm-hmm. My first like large piece was I wrote a piece for like my high school wind ensemble and things like that. And I realized like I wanted the chance to be a composer first. And I figured I could always go back to teaching if I wanted to. And so I dropped out of it was like a vocal performance / education program mm-hmm. at my university. And I dropped out after a day. And I said, I want to be in the composition department. And they were like, well, you have to audition. It was a whole process. And so eventually I kind of transitioned into the composition program and did like a minor in vocal performance instead. And so that's how I started singing. But it wasn't until grad school. I did a lot of singing in college, of course. And then I started writing choral music because I went to school in the South in Nashville. And a lot of my friends got married soon after college. I don't know, it's like a Southern thing. But
it is a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a thing. And because a lot of them were singers, they had me write pieces for their weddings for like quartets or like small choirs and things like that. And so I got into this habit of writing like I wrote like 4 or 5 different choral pieces for weddings. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I had that experience. And then when I went to graduate school, which was in Los Angeles, there was no choir at the university. And some students were really interested in having a choral ensemble. And so they self-organized one. Ooh. And I was the oldest person in the group. I think I was one of the only grad students. and we had too many tenors. So I said, well, I could conduct, and that turned into, oh, I guess I'm teaching this choir class now at this college, and that turned into a whole career. I moved to New York and I joined a bunch of different professional choirs there, and 2 years after that, I started conducting professionally in New York, and that was like when I came back to LA to do my doctorate. One of my jobs, like I went back to CalArts for my doctorate, and I was the choral director. I just showed up first day. I was teaching choir, and then I was teaching 2 choirs, and that was my teaching assignments while I was at the school for my doctorate. So
I just love hearing the story, because then, in your journey, you can now see how everything got, from one point to another one. But during the point, it's like, I'm going to try this and I want to do this. I feel that it's exciting to know.
Yeah, well, a lot of it was about embracing the performer-composer model, right? And this is something that we talk about a lot at CalArts and in Los Angeles in general. And it's becoming more and more of a thing all over the country. But it's, looking not looking at performing and composing as a double major where you do both, but looking at it like being a singer-songwriter, like a person who is creating work for themselves and who understands their own instrument with a certain idiomatic depth, right? I'm going to write for the voice differently because I am a singer. Because I'm used to using this instrument a lot, and I'm used to exploring the instrument in different ways, that I can extend what the voice is asked to do in ways that are intuitive and and are going to still be idiomatic for singers. And so a lot of it, like when I moved to New York, one of the first things I did was join C4, the Choral Composer Conductor Collective, which is a group that has no artistic director. It's made up of singers, composers, and conductors, and about half of every concert is written by the members of the ensemble, right? And so that was how I started really writing meatier choral music. Once a year I would write a piece for C4. And again, as a singer, I was able to explore what singers can do. I could go through and I could sing every line myself and be like, oh yeah, this makes sense.
You were your model.
Yeah, exactly. I could kind of model that kind of stuff, and I could demonstrate it. And I was encountering other composers like Toby Twining and composers like Meredith Monk, who are these big composers for what people call extended vocal techniques. I don't really like that term, but we'll just say for exploring the timbral possibilities of the voice. I don't think there's anything extended about what they do. Like, the voice is the voice. It is not designed to sound a particular way. I think to say that there are extended techniques is to say that there is a bass technique that is proper technique, and that feels very ethnocentric. Like, we study bel canto in the European classical tradition, but in the Balkans they don't study bel canto, and in the musical Broadway tradition they don't study bel canto, right? And in Korean pansori, they study their own type of singing, and whatever it is, like, there's all these different kinds of singing that are totally valid, and I don't want to take those away by calling them extended techniques. They're just, different
voice.
Traditions. Yeah, it's just the voice. I guess we could have a theological discussion about whether the voice is designed and whether it's designed to do anything in particular. But in terms of singing, I think we can see from all the traditions that exist in the world that there's tons of ways to explore timbre and the voice. And exploring timbre is such a core part of what is happening in the new music world in general. And looking at, of course, there's whole genres like spectralism that looks at tuning and timbre and things like that. But just, like, starting with Cage and his exploration of sound and the quality of sound, that world has sort of escaped the choral medium, right? A lot of choral music is about finding this very particular sound that's been inherited from the English choral cathedral tradition. And, we emphasize blend. And like, everyone sort of universally accepts in the choral world that blend is one of our values, but it's not an inherent value in choral music, right? Opera choruses don't want to blend. It's about a group of individual voices singing together in a group. Gospel choir doesn't necessarily even want to blend, right? So looking at kind of how we can re-examine our values in the choral music and what sort of creative opportunities that opens up for us is very exciting for me.
How awesome. And the openness that then this way of thinking, being open to not call it extended techniques and to see how the voice is an instrument that is able to do all of these things, just give us tools as a composers. Hey people, I want to take a quick second to tell you how your support makes a difference. When you support me on patreon.com, you are not only giving $3 a month, but you are giving my brand a vote of confidence. This translates to helping several other artists to connect through choral music. Think about it as a cup of coffee that you invite me once a month. Only that is way more impactful and personal. Plus you get to be part of the behind the scenes of my career as a composer, with the many perks that I shared in there. Even if you're not able to give right now, your support listening to this podcast is great, even more if you leave a review in iTunes. Patreon.com/composercordero is the link that you want to visit or share with others. Hope to see you there. At any time in your journey in music, did you see yourself where you are today with your own publishing company?
I mean, I never thought I would be a publisher. That was that made no sense to me. I mean, I didn't really know. I should also say I never knew what a career in music really looked like because I didn't have a model for it. Right? Like growing up, my model was always teaching because that's what I saw professional musicians doing. And it took me a long time to realize that my teachers were not full-time professional musicians. They were full-time teachers that also composed and performed, as part of their work. And so I had no model for this. I mean, no one told me that after I finished school, I should go to a big city and I should start auditioning. I had no clue, right? I finished school and I worked in a coffee shop. I mean, that's what I did. I had no clue. I opened up my own brick and mortar business that was an art space. I taught voice lessons, and I helped kind of like curate concerts eventually, but I just had no clue what being a professional looked like. And someone once gave me a book on finance after I had finished my my graduate program or my master's. And they were like, musicians, like, we're so bad with finance. We have no idea. We're never going to retire. Like, check out this book. This is a very helpful resource. And one of the things that the book talked about was looking at your assets. What assets do you have? And I was like, okay, well, what the hell is an asset? And they're like, like an asset could be your stocks and bonds. Okay, well, I'm 27 years old. I have no stocks and bonds. It could be your rental properties. And I'm like, okay, well, who's got a rental property, right? It could be your intellectual property. And I was like, okay. And then I thought about it and I was like, oh, actually, I do have a lot of intellectual property. I have this whole world of compositions that are just gathering dust on my hard drive. And then I started realizing there's a lot of other composers I know that are also not utilizing the intellectual property that they own, and that I could, like, I'm good at business. I didn't think I was good at business. I knew I was good at selling stuff, right? Mm-hmm. I had worked in retail. I had worked in I'd worked at like a lot of coffee shops and bakeries, and I learned about myself that if I really love something, it doesn't matter what it is, I am happy to sell it to people as long as I really believe in it. I mean, sometimes that's this like pumpkin spice milkshake that was just unbelievable. We used to sell at this one coffee shop I worked at. It was like, it was like this like locally made ice cream, and then it was like actual pumpkin, and or there was this one peanut butter chocolate pie that we used to sell. It was just people would come up to me and be like, "Look, I don't like peanut butter, and I'm not a pie person." And I was like, "But you got to try this one, And it's like, "Okay, fine." I said, "You know what? I'm gonna buy you this slice of pie, and if you don't like it, that's totally fine. Like, you just bring it back. I'm gonna eat it." I had no problem, wholeheartedly. And people would come back and they'd be like, "Can I get a whole pie?" I was like, I know, this is like a really good pie. And I found that I would do that with music anyway, like music that I really loved. I was always talking about it, like, "Oh, throw on headphones. You got to check this piece out." Or I was just singing this tune, and it's this amazing experience. There's this one moment where it has this kind of transcendental chord that pops up out of nowhere, and it it feels like getting kicked in the ribs by a horse, but like in a good way. And I found myself like always advocating for music that I loved. And so, for the publishing company, it was like, oh, I encounter music like this all the time. And I've been performing a lot of music like this in these new music choirs, right? Like when I was at Cal Arts, we were doing, the choir I was teaching was almost all new music, and it was music written by the students, and it was great stuff. And I was like, wow, these student compositions are never going to see the light of day. And when I moved to New York and I was singing with C4, it was the same thing. We were premiering new work constantly, and it was dead in the water afterwards. And so I started reaching out to those composers and saying, listen, if I could organize like a publishing company for and advocate for your work and promote this piece that I really love, would you be willing to work with me? And people were very encouraging, and they said, absolutely. I'm not doing anything with this music anyway, and I believe in you, and I think that you could sell sand to the Saudis, kind of thing. And so that's kind of how it started. As I realized that, like, not only did I want a retirement plan for myself, but I could help advocate for this new music. I could help make these composers famous. Like, I will say, having your music published is not a way to get rich, at least not at first, right? Like, if you have a lifetime of writing and publishing your own music, and you build a career out of it, and it's at all popular, hopefully by the end of your career, you're bringing in enough royalties to sort of retire. That's the hope. So my goal is not to make my composers rich, at least not in the short term, right? My goal is to make them famous, and maybe to make myself rich. I don't think that'll ever happen, but at least maybe like this could be my retirement plan one day. But the main thing is, trying to advocate for new composers that people have not heard of. And then when people love their work, connecting them with the directors, helping them organize commissions down the road. So a lot of what the publishing company does is not just advocating for the pieces, but I also work a little bit like an agent for certain pieces, and I think that's not something that most publishers do. But because I'm a small company, because I only publish around 10 pieces a year, I intentionally keep it small. I intentionally try to do a lot of that sort of advocacy. I try to focus on the composers I have, and then expand the roster of composers slowly, rather than just constantly bringing new people on. So I publish maybe 10 pieces a year, but I would say I only bring on 3 or 4 new composers a year, if that makes sense. Because I'm always going back to my same composers and saying, okay, what have you got? How can I bring your work as a whole to the surface? Because if you're advocating a new piece for you, it can also start pointing to your previous pieces and show how your ideas are connected and whatever it is. So that part's been really fun, and also just like getting to know some really top-notch composition talent.
Well, and what I love also is that it just shows your passion for talking about this music and trying to find them the places where they can be heard. Because, as you say, you perform it or you hear it somewhere, and then that's where it.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm trying to get like C4 recently, I guess not too recently, but a few years ago, performed at the Eastern Division ACDA conference. And they performed, just like, it was unlike anything else that anybody else performed at the conference, right? Everyone else was doing Whitaker and Oleg Yellow and Jake Runestad and, the kind of, and Abby Batinas and Jocelyn Hagen. And C4 showed up and did music that no one had from composers no one had ever heard. Ever, and afterwards, and a lot of the stuff were things that I published, and it was great to have them perform and have people run up to the booth afterwards and say, "Hey, they said I could find this piece here. Do you have it?" And that was so satisfying to know that when people hear that new stuff, they get excited about it and they want to do it themselves.
And if they can find it somewhere, they will go look for it.
Absolutely, right, yeah. So, and I have a vocal sextet in LA. That does like only kind of newer music. And again, I publish a lot of music that we do. Like, we get really great stuff in 6 parts, and I'm like, oh, this could totally translate as choral music. We just premiered a piece called The Einstein Complex, and then I just published it a few months ago, and it's just a great piece for full choir, and you can hear a recording of people doing it one on a part. But then C3LA in Los Angeles is going to do it in a couple months, and that's really exciting to see. I don't know, just like how having these connections with different music groups, how I can use them as as curation tools. I can get music
Yeah.
filtered through these groups, and also have really great professional level performances to show people how the piece sounds at its best, and encourage them to perform it.
August 2nd, 1939. Some recent word like bird against the dawn leads me not to expect that the elements uranium turned into a new and important source, maybe turned into a new and important source, maybe turned into a new and important source, maybe turned into a new and important
I just want to quickly remind you that all of the links that are mentioned in this episode will be in the show notes in thehappychoir.com/podcast or find it in the description of this episode. Also, once you are there in the website, you can subscribe to the newsletter. This will come with a $20 discount for your next choral recording, a free guide that I've created just for you on the things that I've discovered in my career on how to be a happy composer, conductor, or singer. You will also receive a weekly email with podcast episodes, blog posts, and music. I hope to see you there. Now, let's get back to this episode.
And some of the stuff is like particularly interesting and challenging, or like in certain ways, but a lot of it's not. I mean, there's plenty of pieces in the catalog that have been toured by college choirs. College choirs do a lot of the music, but we've got pieces that are done by high schools, or there was one piece that we just taught to like a visiting choir from China and like 2 rehearsals, and then they performed at a festival. And we do all, like there's stuff there that if you're willing to do it, is going to be an exciting, new, different sound for your choir and for your audiences. And I think that's one of the big challenges that I've run into is how conductors are finding new work, because my experience has been that many conductors program music that they have already performed themselves, right? Or music that they have found but that they have heard in a concert setting and said, oh, that's cool, I would do that piece. And so, so working with lesser known composers that are writing great work has been a challenge, because I have to find a way to get it into people's ears. And that's another reason why I like working with these local or these like new music groups like C3LA or C4 or my own sextet Hex is that we can be a sort of, in some ways, like a repertoire ensemble for these different choir, for these different like conferences and things like that. Like we can perform at those kinds of things and show people what's available. And I think that would be, I don't know, trying to do more things like that.
What I also love about this is that you are also showing that, first of all, it's doable, because a lot of people are somehow afraid of these pieces because they think, oh, new music, that's going to be hard, that's going to be a different sound, and they might not want to take that adventure, but they don't know until they hear it. So with these ensembles, you're showing that it's awesome. It's a wonderful journey for the audience, for the singers, for the conductors, and there's so much education and growth with these pieces, because then you realize that your voice is capable of so much more.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. A whole world of expression. Yeah, I mean, there's one piece. There's one piece that I had alluded to earlier that it's all about exploring the sound of the voice. It's a piece called Demon by a local composer in Los Angeles, Matt Brown, and it's also it's a graphic score, right? So because one of the main limitations of Western notation is that it's really great for dealing with time and pitch and things like that, but it doesn't have a solid way of notating timbre, right? Like when we're talking about different timbres for the voice, usually the way that we do it is at the beginning of the score we say flute or violin or clarinet or whatever, and that's how we determine the sound that we want. There's an expected way that the flute is supposed to sound, and there's an expected way that the violin is supposed to sound. And when he's asking for all kinds of different sorts of sounds and techniques, different shades of dark to bright, different levels of noise in the sound, right? How do you notate someone going, right? Like, how do you notate that? You don't. So what he does is he created his own, and this is very common for graphic scores, right? He created his own symbols for each of these sounds, and then he uses verbal instructions, and he says vocal fry on a low pitch, something like that. But what I love about that piece is that, you can't get the notes wrong, right? It's all sound and texture.
And it will sound different.
Yeah, it'll totally sound different, but it reads left to right, top to bottom, right? You just do what the score says. You follow the conductor still. You still have to listen and engage with ensemble. You have to follow the dynamics and all that other kind of stuff. But the bar of quote unquote difficulty is relatively low. Right? Like, again, because you can't get the notes wrong, this is the piece that we were able to teach to a visiting group from China, high school students, in 2 rehearsals, and then they performed it at a festival. I'm doing it right now with a community college choir, and so, with the community college, you don't have upper division students that have been there for 3 or 4 years. Like most of the students are there in their first year or their second year. Yeah. And the level of experience is just a little bit lower. And yet this piece, no problem. They're totally loving it. And so stuff like that, totally accessible. And it's a great way for them to learn about graphic scores, to learn about timbre, to discuss what a musical score is, right? Like the choir there's 2 choirs at the community college that I'm teaching at. And one of the choirs, the one that's doing this piece, I mean, it's almost like a no audition choir, right? There's like a very minimal level. Some students don't read music at all, and yet they can totally engage with this piece on a satisfying musical and artistic level. Yeah. We can get into the story. We can tell how to tell the story of the piece. It has words and a lot of noise and texture and all that kind of stuff too. So anyway, just as an example, this is one way to, and in some ways it's a more extreme way, but this is one way to bring together what's happening in new music and what's happening in choral music. Right. And this was really written for an ensemble. This piece sounds best when it's a group of at least 20 or 30 or 40, 50 singers. Right. When you have more voices to create more nuance in the texture. But honestly, most of the music that I publish is SATB with minimal divisi, but again, the sound world sometimes is extended. People are asking for different kinds of techniques sometimes, or the sound world that's influencing the composition. For instance, I have 2 composers that I work with that are originally from the Philippines, and Filipino culture is a big singing culture, and they have a lot of singing. They have a lot of choral music. My wife is Filipino. She grew up with like 3 karaoke machines in her house. It's just like it's an integral part of the culture. Yeah, and these composers, I want to be really clear. These composers are not writing arrangements of Filipino folk songs, right? They're not writing folk music or like Filipino music, but coming from this culture and coming from their their own musical folk background, it's influencing their work in the way that like I would say that like Hungarian folk music influenced Bartók,
Yeah.
right? Or like or Stravinsky allowed different kinds of musical traditions to influence his work, or maybe even Copland, although he was actually taking certain tunes. But even then, like, he was just allowing the American folk tradition to influence his music. He wasn't, no one looks at Appalachian Spring. Is that what it's called? Appalachian Spring, something like that,
so.
whatever it's called. And no one's saying like, oh yeah, he just arranged a folk tune, right? It's like, no, he wrote a ballet, or like Rodeo, right? Like his piece Rodeo, it's inspired by Americana or Fanfare for the Common Man, or whatever those kind of like big pieces are. And in the same way, these composers from other traditions are allowing the sound world and the rhythmic world of the Philippines to enter into their wholly original music. So like one of the composers, for instance, another local composer from Los Angeles, Sonder Choi, wrote a piece called American Breakfast. And American Breakfast is a piece that's about it's a piece that's really about gun violence. He wrote it in response to the Pulse shootings in Florida that happened a few years ago. And he and what I like about this piece is that it's a piece that shows, it doesn't tell. It's not a finger wagging piece that's making a political statement about how we need to have gun control and things like that. It's not about that at all. The piece is a human piece. It's about the human experience of waking up every morning to the news of gun violence and that anxiety or the numbness or the dread of what it's like to have that news in front of you, or to have to ignore it to get on with your day. And that's what that piece is. But if you look at the piece, it's not this slow, sorrowful, mournful piece. It's multimetric, it's rhythmic, it's got this whole kind of like, in the original version of the score, he said, he asks the tenors to come in bubblegum pop, a la Justin Timberlake. And he has the altos to come in bubblegum pop, a la Britney, right? Like he's looking for these sort of, and then the whole thing is, the text was just, we're just like we're from the instructions of an AR-15. So they're just going, boom, semi-automatic. Oh God, semi-automatic, and it's got this sort of like pop vibe to it.
Yeah.
And it grooves. Like the piece is like, you could shake your booty to it. And it's still about this sort of dark kind of thing. And the way he has interlocking rhythm, you can see his influence from the Philippines, right? But it's certainly not Filipino music.
Semi-automatic. Semi-automatic. Lever set to fire. Lever. Semi-automatic. Lever. Fire.
Lever set to fire.
Lever. The trigger is squeezed.
Set to fire.
Semi-automatic is squeezed.
The trigger is
Lever.
squeezed.
Fire. The trigger is semi-automatic. The trigger.
The trigger. The trigger.
The trigger is squeezed. Semi-automatic.
The trigger rotates.
The trigger rotates.
The trigger rotates.
Semi-automatic. The lever.
The lever.
The trigger rotates.
The trigger. The lever.
Semi-automatic.
The trigger rotates.
The trigger rotates. Semi-automatic.
The trigger rotates.
The trigger rotates. Semi-automatic.
The trigger. The trigger rotates.
The trigger rotates. Semi-automatic.
The trigger.
The
Such a striking piece, and I'm excited to get to show you next week the next part of this interview. Remember that the Happy Choir podcast is here to help you connect with others through choral music. So for now, see you in the next episode of the Happy Choir podcast. Ciao, people! You've been listening to the Happy Choir podcast. For more information and show notes, visit thehappychoir.com. You're listening to episode number 27 of the Happy Choir podcast. Woohoo! Hola people, I'm Carlos Cordero, host and creator of the Happy Choir podcast, helping you connect... What? Podcast? Helping you connect with others through choral music. That was weird. This is part 2 of episode number 26, but I decided to name it 27 just to help me get those numbers up. In this episode, we're going to continue listening to Fahad Siadat, talking so passionately about the way that he thinks about new choral music and also how he curates this music for Siadat, the music publishing company that he founded exclusively for emerging composers and new music. If you haven't listened to part 1 of this interview, aka episode 26, then you gotta go there to listen to learn more about Fahad Siadat's journey to here. But this episode is filled with new music, great performances, and the insights of a publisher who's also out there writing music, performing music, and conducting. He does it all, as we learned. So before we get there, let me remind you the ways that you can help the Happy Choir podcast even more. But you being here listening to us, it's awesome. You can share your favorite episode on Instagram, Facebook, any social media. You can leave a review in iTunes that help us get us found. That help us getting found. Yeah, that's the way, the right English. And then you can also go to patreon.com/composercordero, where for as little as $3, you can help this podcast grow so much. And every dollar counts. So now let's get to this episode. And it breaks all of the barriers that then we feel of, oh no, we cannot write that in choral music, or we cannot write this. I mean, it's still art, and it's still something that needs to be performed out there and needs to be talked about. So
yeah, and and what you're saying is exactly right. It's still art, right? It's not just politics or a social statement. He's talking about a human experience, an emotional experience. And this is what I like is the most is pieces that show and don't tell an idea.
Yeah.
I think that's a really, especially right now where more and more people are engaging in work around issues of social justice and political issues, is how to maintain a level of artistic integrity in the work. There's another piece by a composer originally from Washington. Her name is Sarah Rimkus, and it's called Uprooted. And it's also dealing with a sort of like some social, historical justice situations. It's a piece where she sets text by 2 women she interviewed who were part of the Japanese concentration camps in outside of Seattle, Washington. And they were children at the time, and now they're adults. And they remember this experience of being American, born and raised in America, and then, being sent to a concentration camp. Like, this happened in American soil in the hyper-liberal Pacific Northwest, right? Like, this happened here. It happened all over the place. I mean, it happened in Southern California too. It happened everywhere. this piece is just, again, it's not this sort of finger wagging like, oh, well, look at us, we're bad, and this was wrong. It's about these two people's experience and what it's like to look back on it, and what it's like to for them to, the fear that they experience whenever they see any kind of group being oppressed. And they're like, we know where this can go. We've seen it. We've been there. We've experienced it firsthand. And again, so much of the piece is about swimming textures and creating this sense of loss and almost dreamy nostalgia for something that happened in a person's past that seems unreal, right? Did that really happen? I was so young. And yet I know it happened. Like, I remember it, but it was also a long time ago, and it feels like a dream. Yeah. And so, this piece, it feels like a little bit like a dream, and it feels a little bit like, I don't know, like storytelling. There's a really big narrative aspect, these solo lines that are kind of freely telling a story over the more rhythmic aspects of what the choir is doing underneath. I think that kind of stuff is really interesting and relevant, and she's creating a sound world that again is just uncommon.
And that's something else that I love also about new music, is that I feel it opens doors for new stories, or new ways to telling the stories, because I feel that for some of the music out there, before, there were no ways of telling these stories or these kind of texts, or having these risks, or creating different textures, there is so much that this, then, let's say, blur line between, what's vocal, what's choral, what's, as you said, I don't know, more pop or more classical. This openness to it opens also. Openness.
Totally,
wow.
yeah. Yeah, and no, but part of what I like too is like how these composers are also giving the ensembles a level of creative control on how the piece is told as well, right? Like, a lot of new music is not about detailing every little aspect of the score, but understanding that performance is creative and performance is interpretive, and embracing that quality. So, of course, pieces like Demon, that are a graphic score, make this explicit. But Sarah Rimkus, and if people in the choral world are not familiar with her work, like, I just heavily endorse Sarah Rimkus.
Yes.
She's wonderful stuff. And so her a new piece of hers that I'm getting ready to publish is called Thy Sea is Great, O Lord, I think is the name of the piece. And I was listening to a recording of it, and again, the whole thing is these like beautiful swimming textures. I think the whole text of the piece is, Thy sea is great, O Lord, and my boat is so small.
Wow.
And it's just about like the vastness of the world around us and our own weakness in the face of nature, and sort of asking for mercy. And the piece creates this just increasingly large texture, right? And I saw the score, and the whole thing fits on a broadsheet. It fits on one big piece of paper, and it just goes across. And it's like a 7-minute piece, and you realize that the choir and the director have a lot of say in how the piece goes, and how it unfolds, and how the textures are developed.
Hey people, I want to take a quick second to tell you how your support makes a difference. When you support me on patreon.com, you are not only giving $3 a month, but you are giving my brand a vote of confidence. This translates to helping several other artists to connect through choral music. Think about it as a cup of coffee that you invite me once a month. Only that it's way more impactful and personal. Plus, you get to be part of the behind the scenes of my career as a composer, with the many perks that I shared in there. Even if you're not able to give right now, your support listening to this podcast is great, even more if you leave a review in iTunes. Patreon.com/composercordero is the link that you want to visit or share with others. Hope to see you there.
They are given a lot of that creative control. And I love that. I think that it embraces the idea that there's this partnership, that the composers are not living in some sort of ivory tower, and then they give it to the director, and the director is then the master. I mean, this is something I learned in C4 and in C3LA, right? Like, we call directors maestro, but who's the master when the composer is also in the room? Or the composer is alive? And like, you can call, right? I say this to people all the time. Sometimes I've got one piece in particular that's called Hymn to Aethon. It's particularly popular nowadays. It's received a few dozen performances, and most of the time people reach out and they say, "Hey, we're performing your piece, and we just had some questions," because again, there's a lot of specific sounds that are being asked for, and sometimes I'm shocked when people don't reach out and ask. I'm like, I'm right here. Like, you have my email address, my website, there's a contact form, here's my phone number. We've met in person. Like, you can ask. I can Skype with your choir, whatever. And I think people forget that like, with living composers, we are happy and willing to have a real conversation. It's teamwork. And I should say, like, with these pieces where the sound world is such a vital part of the piece, I've had people who did not ask, right? Or who did not want to do a Skype session. And then I hear a recording later and I'm like, oh, that's not how that goes, right? Like, you could have, and sometimes I have to go back and I have to fix the score, where I see that something was unclear. But, a lot of those things, like, it's a living, breathing conversation about how to interpret music. And if you're curious, just like, call up your local composer.
Yeah.
That's definitely a thing.
the best fun that I have is when I get to also be vulnerable and let the ensemble tell me to, okay, what is it that you see there? Because as composers, we don't see it all. We don't have the the whole. We might have ideas of how the piece sounds, and of course, we have a good concept of it. But sometimes ensembles also say an idea, and you just, why didn't I think of that? I love it. I love
totally.
That. I feel it's a teamwork too, and to be able to open these options for conductors and the singers in the choir to offer their thought too, I think it's also more human to the experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah, I totally feel that, and I agree with what you're saying. I was just in Oklahoma working with Jeff Wall at Northeastern State University, and they had commissioned a piece recently, and I had the opportunity to workshop it with them. And hearing him run through it the first time, I was like, oh, I like that. Let's put it in the score. Yeah, let's make that explicit, And then as I was running through it, and exactly what you're saying, asking the singers, what do you think about this? Or what's your favorite part? Why? What does this mean to you? It was a text that was very abstract. And the students it was also, I should say, interestingly, it was also a Christian text. It was based on something I had seen in a classroom at a church. It was on a whiteboard, and there's 3 different panels of these different texts, and I thought it was so bizarre. It was called The Analogy of Being, and it's about, I think there must have been a talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and his philosophy around the analogy of being, something that I know nothing about. And there was these great lines. It would say, like, the whiteboard said things like, equivocal, slinky as a dog, univocal, my dog-eared book, analogical, they work just like dogs. And I was like, I don't know what this means, but I'm going to turn it into a piece of music, And so hearing these students, I was in Oklahoma, it's sort of in that Bible Belt sort of area. And a lot of the students were very deeply devout. And they were, first off, they were curious, like, why is a Muslim writing about Christian stuff? But second, they had all this like insight and these questions and these ideas about the piece that really helped me understand it and helped me. Like, after my workshops, I sent them edits, and I said, great, let's do this. Oh, this needs to do this here. And they were very happy to kind of be part of that creative process. So yeah, I think remembering that new music is a living and breathing activity is great.
I've always said that also, if it doesn't happen that way, then, we will just be composers who go to a place and, press play on a laptop. Or on
totally. Absolutely. Yeah, there has to be the human element. The human element's what makes it exciting to me. So I love that.
I have to say that visiting then the publishing company's website, Siadat, then I love how everything is just so clear, number one, but also it's so approachable. I feel that the voice of the company, it's of a friend who tells you, here's new music. It sounds wonderful, and maybe you haven't heard it, but let me help you find what you're looking for. What will be your next piece? How has that worked in then let's call it a conservative choir world?
Well, I think so. There's a couple of things.
Okay.
The first part is, I think you have to understand where the publishing company came from, not just in terms of what I was talking about in terms of like bringing together or like giving a platform to music that I felt like deserves a platform and needs an advocate. But there was also something that happened right around when I was getting ready to start the company. I started the company about the same time I became like a professional choral director. And I realized that I was having a really hard time finding music myself. And because I'm interested in a certain kind of music and a certain kind of new music, I wanted to create a resource that was helpful for me. Basically, like, what do I wish existed in the world? And I've found that question, it has been a really great entrepreneurial question for all kinds of arts entrepreneurship, right? Like, when I write a piece of music, part of my question is, what piece do I wish existed in the world, right? Because if the piece already exists, I'll just go find it and curate it. There's plenty of great composers out there that I know and love, and And if I wish I had written it first, I just my go-to is to try to publish it instead. There's lots of great music that I'm like, oh, I wish I had written that. Okay, I'll just see if I can publish it.
Yeah.
But when I think like, oh, I wish this existed, right? Like right now, I've been working on an oratorio, and I've been working on a couple staged works, like some chamber operas, and a lot of it's because I'm dissatisfied with what I see in the world of opera, and I'm like, oh, I wish opera look like this. Oh, I'll just create that. And I have a choreographer that I work with, and we create these dance operas. I really love what I've been seeing in like the Prototype Festival that Beth Morrison she produces, because it's a lot of people who I think feel the same way. Oh, I wish opera didn't look like how it always has looked. I wish it looked like this. And the publishing company was similar, as I was having a hard time finding music. I wasn't satisfied with the curators of music that were out there, the different sort of like, oh, this person's conductor series. It didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know who that person was. I didn't know how or why I should rely on their taste. The editor's choice for different kind of like retailers looked like what they thought would sell, not necessarily what they thought was like the most exciting art. And so for me, it was about like curating what I hope the future of choral music looks like. And because sometimes it really looks different than how choral music looks to other people, that sometimes it's hard, right? And it starts very slowly. And so what I've done is I've concentrated on creating personal, individual relationships with like-minded conductors and like-minded composers. And I found a lot of them are conductors who also compose.
Yes.
Right. So I found that there's a lot of that crossover. And building relationships with those people. And so what I found is that every year there's a wider and wider group of conductors that come to the publishing company first as one of their primary resources for finding new music. And they buy 2 or 3 pieces or 3 or more pieces every year from the company. And so that's been kind of the core. And then as opposed to like a lot of traditional publishers that are relying on the composer itself, like they know a certain composer, the composer has a brand, they are going to the composer or they're going to the composer's work to find something new. I want a new piece by Tim Tkach. I want a new piece by Jocelyn Hagen, or I want to do one of their works. I know their stuff. I like it. But so what I'm trying to do with the publishing company is create a curation method that people trust, right? So yes. The way that that like Saturday Night Live is a curation of comedy and of comedians and of actors. You go to SNL not knowing who the actors are, but you learn about them through SNL. You go to SNL because it's SNL and it's just like what you do.
Yeah.
And then from there you get people like Kate McKinnon, or Eddie Murphy or whoever, like the big people, who have come out of Saturday Night Live, and they become. So part of what I want to do is be a platform for lesser known composers so that they can become bigger. And it also helps that I have like a handful of very well established composers, like Andrea Clearfield, is like her work gets performed all the time. Sandra Choi and Nilo Alcala, like their stuff is getting performed more and more. Yeah. But again, like I also want to take some level of credit for being part of their growth. Like as they're starting to grow, right, I'm also advocating for their stuff. I'm sending their picture and their bios and their music out through our newsletter to like the couple thousand subscribers there and on social media. And I'm sharing with those interested composers at conferences, and I'm encouraging certain ensembles to take those pieces on tour and things like that. So it goes hand in hand. As their careers are growing, they are helping bring people to the publishing company. And as the publishing company is being known as a curating method, it is a way for people to get introduced to those composers. And that's been really exciting. So it's growing, for a long time. I used to say I lose less and less money on it every year, but for the first time we've actually like turned a profit, and it's going well, and I'm really proud of the music that we've been publishing, and we've got like a really cool slate of new stuff coming up. So,
well, first of all, congratulations on that, because it's amazing to also see not only the advocacy that you do, works for others, but also for yourself, because that's also important. It's also that important that the company is able to survive and continue.
Yeah, totally. Like I said, it's the retirement plan one day. But honestly, like, I mean, it's not something, I don't think I'm ever going to roll around in gold coins with it. All the money that we make, we just funnel right back into it to do marketing and, and to get word out about these composers. And we've been trying some different things with a publishing company as well. For instance, like, we just released a collection of pieces that are for beginning choirs, like for like middle school choirs or, like unauditioned community choirs or our college choirs or things like that, where we took pieces in the catalog, like existing pieces that we've already curated because they're great works. And we've asked the composers, or we've worked with the composers to make arrangements of them for unison choir or 2-part choir or 3-part choir. And then what we're doing is we're selling it as a packet, right? So it's like 5 pieces, it's $100, it's a PDF, and you can make as many copies as you want forever. Because like one of the big struggles for middle schools in particular, and for community colleges and things like that, is that they never have a budget for commissioning new work. Yeah. And so it's very rare that like a well-known or well-established or really prolific composer is writing a new piece specifically for a middle school choir. And so the quality of middle school music and like 3-part music or 2-part music is just, it tends to be less refined than the stuff that is being commissioned by the big community choirs and professional choirs and things like that, who have the budgets to attract, whatever, Caroline Shaw or Andrea Clearfield or Jake Runstead, or people who are like really established in that world. So we've been trying to bridge that gap by providing a resource to middle schools and providing this particular collection of stuff. And that's been fun. So we're doing that, and then also like that's kind of one of the big projects.
And I also feel from a composer standpoint that these are also, it is an incredible opportunity because these pieces might not see the lights of another publishing company because of their difference, right? Because people will be thinking, maybe on the selling point or maybe on the conservative side, thinking, oh, maybe, this is not choral music, so it's
Yeah, I mean, I think I think most people will still consider it to be choral music. It's just, like there's a couple things. One, I think if people aren't already familiar with the music or the techniques, they are concerned about how to teach it to their choir.
okay.
And this is something that I've experienced myself as a curator. I feel the most comfortable programming a piece for my choir if I have performed the piece myself, because I know how it goes. I know it from the inside out, and I know how to teach it because I know how I was taught the piece, right? So some of that is about how we can break down barriers for people. One of the things that we do, for instance, is we provide rehearsal tracks, like MIDI rehearsal tracks, for every piece in the catalog when it's appropriate. The graphic score Demon, like, that doesn't have rehearsal tracks, right? But most every other piece does, and we make them available. They're very cheap. They're like $5. You can buy rehearsal tracks, right? Just as a way to help conductors feel like their singers are gonna really knock the piece out of the park. The other thing that we try to do is we try to always connect the conductors with the composer so that they can do Skype sessions, so that they can hear it from the inside out. Because I have, like, part of my curation method is I have performed or conducted like just about every piece in the catalog. And if I haven't done it yet, I'm going to soon, right? That I also offer myself as a resource, right? Like, all of these pieces have been tested by a real choir and a real conductor. And the ones that make it into the catalog are the ones that I can't wait to do over and over again, that I recommend to people and I bring to the table when I am programming for a choir, right? And so a lot of times I have conversations with conductors about how to, like, what are the challenges of the piece and successful ways I have found to approach it. So that's another way that we try to bridge that gap. But then, honestly, I think the big one is the name recognition, right? That
Yes.
Is that if people don't know the composer, they tend to, or they don't know the piece already by having heard it in performance or performed it themselves, and then there is concern about the work and about the time it will take to get to know it. And that's the biggest barrier that I'm trying to hop over by being a curator, right? And developing a sense of curation trust between myself and for conductors. Like, this publishing company is for conductors first, right? I think other independent publishers that have started are there for composers. They try to be an advocate for composers primarily. And my customers are not composers. My business partners are composers. I work with composers to serve conductors, and to serve conductors that are specifically interested in a certain kind of innovative and out-of-the-box kind of music. Things that are moving the conversation of choral music forward, that are part of this 21st century dialogue of what new music is.
And it almost feels like, I don't know if this is too simple, but when one is afraid and then you have your friend there who says, you can do it, here are all the here's why. Here are all the tools that you need to do it, and you can make it. And maybe you cannot see it right now, but you can do it. I know because I've done it, and I'm going to help you.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I feel a lot of hope, right? Like, I feel a lot of hope because the people who like the music in the catalog the most, and the people who like my own music as a composer the most, tend to be young people. Like, we'll do a reading session at a conference, and some students will show up, grad students or something like that, and they'll hear the music. And then for the rest of the conference, and this has happened like at every national conference, for instance, for the rest of the conference, they'll come to the booth. They'll be like, can I hear other stuff of your music? And I'll show them things. And then like 2 hours later, they'll come and they'll have brought 2 friends. You have to listen to this piece I heard. I've never heard anything like it. Great. And then the next day, their friends are bringing friends. Hey, this is the person I was telling you about. Oh, you got to check out this piece. We got to talk to our director about doing it. The directors are more conservative. The directors are scared, but the students are game. And so like a lot of my own personal compositions, they get performed more by student run ensembles than they do the big groups. Right. And they're like, oh, yeah, we have like a chamber group that's sort of student led, and we tend to want to do like new music. And those are the ones that are coming to my catalog all the time. right? And then maybe through them,
awesome.
The conductors are like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, you have more stuff like this. Oh,
Exactly.
let's talk about it. So that's what we try to be. Like a lot of our pieces, I think, tend to be the feature pieces on a program, like the kind of the standout, the standout works. And so we just produced a CD of those works that we think like, okay, if you want this to be the sort of like the one thing that people go home and talk about, this is an entire CD of those pieces. So things like that, I think, are really, that's fun to kind of curate those kinds of works. But then for me as a programmer, honestly, I want every piece that I program on a concert to be a standout piece.
Yeah.
My goal is let's perform no mediocre music. Let's just only perform stuff that we just think is super, super exciting and brilliant. And a lot of that comes from broadening my perspective and my horizons and looking at composers that are coming from different traditions, that are coming from different perspectives. And I find that like really diverse programming leads to this sort of innovative and adventurous programming that I'm looking for anyway. So that all kind of nicely goes hand in hand. Very few of the pieces that I program are by composers named Jonathan or David or James.
I never before realized this, but now I'm starting to see it everywhere. So,
in my church choir, we have 4 people named David that are in the professionals. I mean, it's just totally ridiculous. And one of them's name is actually Jonathan, and his middle name is David, but he goes by David. And then I've got another friend whose name is just Jonathan David. Like, I mean, it's just I publish his work. It's just one of those things.
maybe that's the selling point.
Yeah, maybe so.
Oh my God. Yeah, now I'm going to start seeing it everywhere.
Yeah.
Since we're close to the ending of the interview, I always like to ask my guests, what's one thing that you would like conductors to know or do when they go to program new music for their concerts?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I would like them to take risks on their choir. I think that's the number one thing, especially for college conductors and things like that. A lot of conductors are very concerned, and I get it. Like they're very concerned with making sure that their performances are the best that they can be. And so they tend to program music, and I do this too. We tend to program music that we feel confident we can knock out of the park. And what I found is that when I take risks on my choirs, when I push them, when I put music in their ears that and in their voices that they are not familiar with, they bring a level of enthusiasm and dedication to it that always surprises me. And even if it seems like it would have been a stretch for them, they put in the work because they're excited about the piece. And so what I would encourage conductors to do is to take those kinds of risks, not risks on their audience. Honestly, like choral audiences are mostly our friends and families anyway, right? You're not going to really scare off your audiences. They're a little bit guaranteed, and that's fine. For me as a composer, my audience is the singers. There are so many choral singers. I write for them, and I want to make sure that stuff is because, and they're also the people who are going to spend the most time with it, right? So if you're willing to take those kinds of risks, then what your choir is capable of will grow. And that's really important because as composers, we are restricted by what choirs are comfortable with. What a choir is willing and capable of doing sets the level for what we can write. And the more willing conductors are to help grow their choirs and the capabilities of their choirs, and just again, it's not about challenging music. It's just about looking at different concepts or ideas of music that the conductors might not be familiar with, and they have to spend the time to get familiar with and know the piece from the inside out. The more they're willing to push that envelope, the more composers are going to be able to write a different kind of music that moves the conversation of choral music forward. Right? I mean, that's exactly what Eric Whitacre did, right? He was able to find, and this is what I try to find in my own catalog, right? He was able to find a way to extend the harmonic density of music by great writing, right? By like good part writing and embracing stepwise motion and certain diatonic harmonies. He was able to create large, thick harmonies that high school choirs can easily do. And because choir directors were willing to look at this technique and this style of music and teach their choirs how to become familiar with it, it totally changed the choral landscape. And more people, like composers, are now able to write those sorts of thick kind of harmonies using the composition techniques that Whitaker did, right? And so, I've noticed that more and more pieces that perform my piece Hymn to Aethon that uses, it's only 4 parts. It's SATB. There's minimal divisi, right? Harmonically, it's not terribly complex. And because of that, more and more groups are performing it. Because they're performing it more and more, it's opening the door for other composers to engage with those groups in terms of timbre and sound as an expressive and creative device. And that's all completely due to conductors who are willing to engage and were willing to try it and saying, hey, I don't know how to teach my choir how to make those sounds, but you could do it, and I'm going to have you do it through Skype, or I'm going to have you come out to a rehearsal, and you know what I mean? And again, going back to that partnership idea, but them willing to engage and try things out and learn and continue to grow as conductors, but not just program the things that are already familiar and comfortable to them, then we can move this conversation forward in very exciting ways.
Oh, I love it. It's true, because then, as you said, it all also comes to the education or the learning side that also conductors have to do to be able to advocate for this music to their students, to their audiences, to their programs. So I just want to quickly remind you that all of the links that are mentioned in this episode will be in the show notes in thehappychoir.com/podcast, or find it in the description of this episode. Also, once you are there in the website, you can subscribe to the newsletter. This will come with a $20 discount for your next choral recording, a free guide that I've created just for you on the things that I've discovered in my career on how to be a happy composer, conductor, or singer. You will also receive a weekly email with podcast episodes, blog posts, and music. I hope to see you there. Now, let's get back to this episode. Can you share with us upcoming events? Where can we find your music or your performances?
Sure, yeah. So Los Angeles has a really great new music festival called the Here Now Festival. And my vocal sextet is one of the ensembles in residence. They have a string quartet, Pierrot ensemble, and we're the vocal ensemble in residence. And we have, on April 24th, we're doing a voice and electronics concert, where we're doing a really great graphic score that actually I'm going to publish in the coming months, called Ring of Bone, that was premiered by C4 in New York. It's by a composer, David Harris, who I mentioned earlier, and is the director at the church I work at. And so that's going to be it's kind of beautiful graphic score piece for 6 voices and electronics. And then on May 1st, as part of the Here Now Festival, we're also premiering a piece called Zenspiel by a local composer, Vicky Ray, who is a pianist and composer. And it's for... she does a lot of writing for the inside of the piano and sort of extended techniques for the piano, as well as solo voice and then vocal ensemble. So that's happening then in terms of the ensemble world. For my own work in May, I'll be performing at the Red Cat Theater, which is part of the Walt Disney Concert Hall, with a group called Parch that does microtonal compositions using Harry Parch's replicas of Harry Parch's instruments, and they're really cool. And we're doing a couple scenes from his Harry Parch's opera King Oedipus, I think it's called, or Oedipus Rex or something. And then the big one that I want to share with everybody is this summer I am a co-director of an annual event called the Neo Voice Festival. It's called New Explorative Oratorio Voice Festival, and it's a 9-day event that happens in Los Angeles that's entirely around exploring and creating and performing new music for the voice. So it's for composers and singers, and we come together. The composers work on what we call the exploratorio, an explorative oratorio, where they create movements for the choir that everyone participates in the festival, and then different singers come as soloists. So, and we rehearse this exploratorio, and we premiere it at the end of the week. We also have like a songbook concert where people are writing art songs and standards and different kinds of numbers for solo voice. We do workshops on voice science and vocal acoustics, how to write for the voice, looking at a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about in terms of how to bridge the gap between what's happening in new music and how to bring it into vocal music, how to bring it to avocational singers. It's a wonderful event. Last year we had over 30 people from 4 different countries come, and we're looking at something very similar for this year, which is going to be really exciting. And we still have a few slots left for applicants. Let's see, by the time this airs in April, we won't have any slots left for featured composers and singers, but we'll have slots open for general participants who want to come and sing in the choir and learn and like do the workshops. It's really an amazing event, and we'll be accepting applications for that through, I think we stop accepting applications June 1st. And the dates for that are July 18th through 26th. So if you're curious, you can go to neovoicefestival.com.
And of course, all of this will be in the show notes, including all of what we've mentioned in the episode. But I just wanted to say thank you, Fahad, so much, because this is such a great interview, but also thank you so much for all of your advocacy work that you do for the choral world and the music world, because then you're connecting all of these different elements.
Yeah, of course. It's my pleasure. I really think, that the more we are willing to engage with new music, the more we are able to expand our horizons and expand our sense of what is possible and what is good and right in the world. And I think, ultimately for me, music is just about bringing people together, helping people be more spiritually whole and kinder to one another and more satisfied in who they are. And a lot of that comes, for me, a lot of that comes from being willing to try on new things and be exposed to new things and realize that, yes, that too is part of what I know and love in the world. And the more that we do that, I think the more that we'll know and love just about everything.
Wonderful, Fahad. Where can people find you online?
You can go to my website. It's fahadsiadat.com. The publishing company is Siadat Music, SEEADOT.music. Or you can go to bestnewchoralmusic.com. It will also take you there. And then through my website or through the publishing company, you can find links to just about everything else.
Yay. Thank you so much, Fahad. Thank you so much for being in the Happy Choir podcast.
Totally. It's my pleasure.
Remember that the Happy Choir podcast is here to help you connect with others through choral music. See you in the next episode of the Happy Choir podcast. Ciao, people. You've been listening to the Happy Choir podcast. For more information and show notes, visit thehappychoir.com.